2 years had passed in the quiet isolation of the manor. On a bright midsummer morning, Rosalyn walked through a 1,000-meter corridor draped in blooming purple wisteria. She made her way toward a secluded corner formed by a collapsed overpass, pushing aside thick shrubs to reveal a hidden pile of thatch. This was her secret foraging spot, a place where a wild hen frequently laid eggs. It was a small luxury that allowed her to improve their meals every few days. Now 12 years old, Rosalyn cut a much more slender and capable figure in her adventuring gear. Compared to the girl who had arrived 2 years ago, she had lost her childish innocence, replaced by the budding grace of a young woman. Standing over 155 centimeters tall, she was rapidly approaching the height of her master. Rosalyn peered into the thatch and whispered to herself with a smile, "Let's see. Oh, 5 eggs this time. I'll only take 2, Lady Chicken. I hope you won't be angry." She carefully tucked 2 eggs away and turned to leave, but her path was suddenly blocked. The hen that confronted her was nothing like a normal bird. It stood nearly as tall as Rosalyn herself, its head topped with a bulbous, sickly tumor covered in writhing tentacles. Its featherless body and fleshy wings dripped with a foul-smelling, acidic slime. Rosalyn sighed softly, her voice steady despite the monstrosity before her. You don't look very well, Lady Chicken." The creature showed clear signs of cephalic mutation and exposed flesh. By Yvette's standards, this was a textbook basic aberration. In the old world of the radiant language, such a monster could easily slaughter a group of grown men, and its corruption would eventually consume an entire village. The aberration let out a piercing, distorted screech and lunged forward. Its sharp beak cut through the air like a jagged blade. Rosalyn didn't panic. The moment the creature drew near, a swirl of green wind enveloped her, allowing her to glide effortlessly to the side. With a practiced flick of her wrist, she unleashed a dozen small blue mana bullets. They struck the hen with the force of a shotgun blast, instantly encasing the creature in a block of solid ice. "Let me put you out of your misery," Rosalyn said with a hint of sadness. She snapped her fingers, and a torrent of crimson flames erupted, swallowing the frozen bird. The mutated creature let out one final, muffled roar before collapsing into a charred, lifeless heap. Rosalyn stood over the remains, feeling a pang of loneliness. Though she and the original hen had a history of minor squabbles over eggs, the bird had been a constant presence. Now, even that small connection was gone. She wondered to herself, "I wonder what Master's life was like before I arrived. A master like her probably doesn't get lonely like I do. She'd be happy even without me. It's me who needs her." She bowed deeply to the remains of the hen and offered a minute of silence. Just as she turned to leave, another hen stepped out from the brush, clucking angrily at her. Rosalyn looked at the very familiar, very healthy bird, then back at the charred corpse she had just mourned. Her expression froze in embarrassment. "Oh." A short time later, back at the manor, Yvette sat in the tea room with a book in her hand. She looked up as Rosalyn entered, noting the girl's disheveled hair. "Where did you go?" Yvette asked with a hint of suspicion. "You didn't cross the safety boundary again, did you?" Since gifting Rosalyn the Sky Ring Y2 and teaching her advanced magic, Yvette had granted her more autonomy. She had mapped out Ish City into zones. A 3-kilometer safety zone for free movement, a central district that required reporting, and the outer reaches which were strictly forbidden. Yvette's caution stemmed from her recent discovery of high-level aberrations in the mountains. Creatures that suggested a terrifying, survival of the fittest evolution was occurring across the island. Rosalyn scratched her head sheepishly and explained, No, Master. You warned me I wouldn't go there. I just got into a fight with a chicken." Yvette stared at her in silence for a long moment before returning to her book. Half an hour later, Rosalyn brought over a lunch of fried eggs and other dishes. Yvette closed her book with a satisfied nod and began to eat. The summer sun was pleasant, and a gentle breeze cleared the clouds, leaving a deep, crystalline blue sky. After finishing her meal, Yvette stood up. "Let's go," she said firmly, "to the place with the mist." The mist Yvette referred to was a phenomenon she suspected to be a dream mist, similar to what she had encountered centuries ago in the Abyss facility. They had discovered it during an exploration of the Blackwater district. Rosalyn had walked right through the fog on the second floor of a ruined building without any effect, which led Yvette to a startling realization. The mist only affected her. It was a connection to the past that only she could bridge. They traveled to the site on a Magitech motorcycle capable of low-altitude flight. The vehicle's capacitors were suffering from elemental decay, drastically reducing its range, which forced Yvette to act as a manual battery to recharge it along the way. She made a mental note to search for Magitech engineering knowledge if she managed to return to the past. Knowledge, she reminded herself, was the only way to change one's fate. Upon arriving at the facility in the Blackwater district, they spent an hour clearing the surrounding area of any potential threats. They used wind magic to pile heavy debris against the building's entrances, sealing themselves inside for safety. "Master, I still don't feel anything," Rosalyn said as they reached the second floor and stepped into the swirling white vapor. Yvette hesitated for a moment before following her. The second her body was submerged in the mist, a familiar, overwhelming drowsiness washed over her. She struggled to get the words out, her voice heavy with sleep. "Stay here, guard me." Without another word, Yvette lay down on the dusty floor, using her arm as a pillow, and drifted into a deep, unnatural slumber. The cool night rain tapped against the awning, creating a hollow, rhythmic clicking sound that echoed through the narrow space. Yvette slowly opened her eyes, her vision immediately dominated by a massive holographic projection. A semi-nude virtual beauty licked her lips with programmed seduction, holographic particles swirling around her waist to form flickering words. The advertisement read, "Tired of the cold reality? Craving a hotter touch." Seventh Heaven, featuring the latest spiritual synchronization technology, makes every caress feel thrillingly real. Visit us at Blackwater District coordinates 47.9. Yvette's pupils contracted as she stared at the advertisement for a long moment before finally turning her gaze to her surroundings. She found herself in a dark alley soaked by rain, stretching out into the night. Towering building facades were covered in matte alloy plates, etched with Magitech circuits that flowed with neon streams of deep blue, indigo, and crimson. In the corners, discarded gear-shaped Magitech parts, dusty pipe interfaces, and broken flexible screens piled up alongside foul-smelling trash. A prosthetic hand with exposed alloy joints had been shoved into a pile of refuse, looking as if a mechanical creature were about to crawl out of the filth. "Is this the Blackwater District before the end?" Yvette whispered to herself, her slender fingers brushing damp silver hair behind her shoulder. As she pondered her next move, a familiar, startled voice sounded behind her. "Master, where are we? How did we get here so suddenly?" Yvette spun around to see Rosalyn standing there in her adventure gear. The girl's clothes were dampened by the rain and her blonde hair clung to her cheeks, but her eyes were bright with wonder. She looked like a fawn that had wandered into a strange, futuristic world, curiously taking in the bizarre sights. Yvette asked with surprise, "How did you get in here?" Rosalyn blinked, explaining, "I saw you lying on the ground, Master, and I wanted to put something under you to make you comfortable. But the moment I touched you, I started feeling incredibly sleepy." Yvette realized then that physical contact was the key to entering the dream together, which only confirmed the special connection between her and the dream mist. As the rain intensified, the two moved toward the mouth of the alley. Passers-by began to appear, and Yvette's white dress made her stand out significantly against the modern, trendy clothing of the locals. After walking for a while, Yvette asked, "When you look at these people, what do you feel?" Rosalyn hesitated before answering. They seem curious about us, but also a bit unfriendly. Yvette pressed further, asking if the people looked strange, perhaps transparent or blurry. Rosalyn shook her head, saying they looked perfectly normal. Yvette went quiet, realizing that only she saw the people as blurry, ghostly figures. When Rosalyn asked if she was seeing their true essence, Yvette simply replied, "Perhaps." A few minutes later, as they emerged from the alley, Yvette held 2 ID cards in her hand. Rosalyn asked nervously, "Master, this really is a dream, right?" Yvette nodded to reassure her. She knew from her studies of old books that one couldn't survive in this world without identification. To solve that problem, she had decided on a bit of entrapment. Before leaving the alley, they had circled around until they attracted the attention of 3 young punks in rebellious outfits. The men had surrounded them, their eyes filled with lust, but before they could even lay a finger on the girls, Yvette had struck. She dealt with them as if they were mere aberrations. Cyan wind blades whistled through the air, piercing their chests and leaving them in pools of blood. Rosalyn had been shocked by the cold efficiency of the act, but she quickly followed orders, using her fire magic to incinerate the bodies and erase the evidence. "Do we have identities now?" Rosalyn asked, recovering quickly from the bloody scene. Yvette led her to a public service terminal and explained that they needed to do more. She placed her finger on the touch panel and docked her furnace ring with a sensor slot. Using her magitech knowledge, she began hacking into the police system to modify the ID data. It was a challenge, as she had never practiced these skills in the post-apocalyptic world, but the security in the impoverished Blackwater district was lax. 10 minutes later, Yvette handed a card to Rosalyn. The photo had changed to show the cute face of a blonde girl, and the name read Rosalyn Reshivia. Yvette's own card now bore the name Yvette Scene. She had swapped their surnames because the current year was 2124, just 1 year before her original self was involved in the Rebirth Project. She wanted to avoid any trouble if her past self existed in this dream. Rosalyn, unaware of the historical context, felt a flush of shyness, as changing surnames usually only happened after marriage in her home kingdom. Yvette also attempted to steal the savings from the 3 men she had killed. The bank's firewalls were too strong for a novice hacker, so she settled for selling their digital assets, cryptocurrency, gambling chips, and game accounts. After 2 hours of work, she earned about 6,000 credits, enough for a month in a cheap hotel. She grumbled about the small amount, calling the men poor ghosts, but decided it would have to do for now. As the night fully descended, they found a budget hotel. Rain dripped from Yvette's hair, her wet dress clinging to her body and making the powerful witch look uncharacteristically disheveled. Ever the cautious mentor, she performed a thorough sweep of the room for hidden cameras before letting Rosalyn use the bath. When Yvette finished her own wash, she found Rosalyn standing by the window, staring longingly at the distant central district. The window was coated in a thin film of grime, distorting the neon lights and holographic ads into a blurred kaleidoscope of color. Yet, Rosalyn was mesmerized. To someone from a medieval-level civilization, this was more shocking than anything she had ever seen. "Master, is this God's kingdom?" Rosalyn asked in a dreamy voice. Yvette walked up behind her and replied calmly, "No, but if it is, it belongs to an evil god." Rosalyn giggled softly, unable to take her eyes off the view. When Yvette asked if she wanted to see it up close, Rosalyn nodded enthusiastically. Yvette promised to take her exploring the next day and told her to rest. Filled with excitement for the wonders of the Origin civilization, Rosalyn lay down in bed, though she remained wide awake for the rest of the night. The next morning, before the sun had even crested the horizon, Yvette was pulled from her sleep. She blearily opened her eyes to find her student sitting on the carpet, her upper body slumped against the edge of the bed. Rosalyn stared at her with dark circles under her eyes, looking like a particularly adorable blonde ghost. Rosalyn whispered, "Good morning, master." Yvette blinked, trying to clear the fog from her mind. "How long have you been crouching there?" "Since about 4 o'clock, I think," Rosalyn replied sheepishly. "You're up that early?" Yvette asked. Rosalyn sighed, her shoulders drooping. I couldn't sleep." "I see," Yvette said, sitting up. "Just remember, you're not allowed to lurk by my bedside in the future." Rosalyn let out a soft, whimpering sound, like a dejected puppy who had just been scolded. However, no matter how exhausted her body felt, the thought of exploring this magnificent ancient kingdom made her heart leap with excitement. She hurried to bring Yvette her freshly dried clothes, but her movements were interrupted by the sharp chime of the doorbell. When Rosalyn pulled the door open, her breath hitched. Standing in the narrow, dim hallway was a life-sized doll. The figure had porcelain-white skin that shimmered with a cold, artificial light. As it bowed, its ball-jointed limbs emitted a series of faint, rhythmic clicks. It held 2 boxes in its hands. "Welcome to Sky High Express," the doll said in a melodic, synthesized voice. "This is your delivery. A photo has been taken for confirmation of receipt. We wish you a pleasant life. Goodbye." With the transaction complete, the doll turned and marched away, leaving a stunned Rosalyn standing in the doorway. She stammered, her voice trembling with shock, "Mama, master. There was a doll. It gave me something. How could a doll speak?" Yvette walked over, taking the boxes. That's the clothing I ordered online last night. I told you about this. That was a mechanical golem, a Magitech construct. It looks human, but it's a soulless, inanimate object designed for labor. Rosalyn closed the door, her eyes wide with wonder as she marveled. It's incredible. It's like something out of a fairy tale. Inside the boxes were the outfits they had selected the night before, a minimalist black and white ensemble for Yvette and a youthful blue and white set for Rosalyn. Once they had changed, Yvette gestured toward the door and said, "Let's go." Rosalyn nodded eagerly, following her master out of the inn. Stepping onto the street, she took a deep breath. The air wasn't exactly clean. The pavement was sticky with discarded gum and strange advertisement cards, and the walls were covered in garish graffiti and suspicious stains. To Rosalyn, however, it was nothing. She had seen far filthier streets in the Earl's territory. To her eyes, the world was a marvel of novelty, and even the greasy scent of fried food wafting from a nearby breakfast stall seemed intoxicating. After they finished a quick breakfast, Rosalyn asked with the enthusiasm of a tourist, "Master, where are we going next?" "We'll scout a few locations first to find a way to make some money," Yvette explained. "If you're tired, you can go back and sleep. Tonight, I'll take you to the city center, the area where our home used to be." Yvette knew that the best way to handle the dream mist was to lay low. If they didn't die unexpectedly, the dream would eventually collapse on its own. But to survive comfortably until then, they needed funds. With money, she could find a way to acquire safer identity cards and distance them from the suspicion of murder and hacking, even if those crimes were technically true. Last night, while browsing local forums, Yvette had searched for the city's gray areas. She had spent a small amount of credits in anonymous chat rooms to find the coordinates of several underground markets in the Blackwater district. Her plan was to find work that suited her unique skill set. Once the money was sorted, she could treat her apprentice to the luxuries of the city center and perhaps even buy items to try and bring back to reality when the dream ended. "I'm not tired at all, Master," Rosalyn insisted immediately. Yvette glanced at the dark circles still lingering under the girl's eyes, but simply gave a quiet grunt of affirmation. They were currently on a street known as Pixel Street. It was an ironic name. The local district office's unique approach to the macroeconomics of income distribution meant that the holographic advertisements here were always blurrier and more pixelated than anywhere else in the city. About 5 kilometers away lay their destination, the Junkyard Black Market. It was an underground exchange built into a repurposed air raid shelter beneath a massive waste disposal site. It was a place for illicit trades, notoriously hostile to outsiders. Without a trusted contact to vouch for them, entry was usually impossible. Yvette had no such contact, but she intended to get in anyway. They stepped off a bus that smelled of stale chemicals and found themselves on the edge of the Blackwater district. The road overlooked vast, fenced-off barrens where mountains of trash loomed like jagged peaks. 2 massive men guarded the entrance to the junkyard. One had short hair and the other was bald, both standing nearly 2 meters tall with imposing bionic arms that gleamed with industrial power. As Yvette and Rosalyn approached, the bald man stepped forward, his voice a cold snarl. "Hey kids, this isn't a place for you. Go home." It was clear the guards saw 2 beautiful girls in clean, new clothes and assumed they were lost students who had wandered into the wrong neighborhood. Yvette didn't argue. She looked up at the bald man with an expressionless face, waiting until his impatience reached its peak. Then, she snapped her fingers. A crisp sound echoed through the air. Suddenly, 4 massive, glowing red runic circles manifested around Yvette. From each ring, a ferocious dragon made of pure flame erupted, coiling and circling above her head. In an instant, the young girl looked like a celestial angel of fire, majestic, terrifying, and absolute. "A cyber mage?" the bald man gasped, his bravado vanishing instantly. He stumbled back several paces, his face pale. His companion's expression shifted to one of pure dread. In the gray zones of the Origin civilization, these were the most dangerous people one could encounter. They were often known by another, more whispered title, rune hackers. "What do you want?" the bald guard asked, trying to regain his composure while keeping a safe distance of 10 meters. His bionic arms were low-end models, built for strength but useless against high-level magic. He had no desire to pick a fight with a mage. Yvette let the magic dissipate, her voice remaining flat and cold. "We're here to do business, and no, we don't have a sponsor." The guards looked at each other in confusion. Their market dealt in small-time contraband for the local dregs. Why would a prestigious cyber mage bother with such a place? Respected mage, please wait a moment," the bald man stammered. "We can't make this decision. We have to notify our boss first." Yvette gave a slight, imperious nod of her chin, signaling for them to make it quick. Moment later, the iron gate at the entrance of the air raid shelter opened with a piercing screech of metal on metal. Standing behind the door was a giant of a man, nearly 2.5 meters tall. He wore a simple black shirt that struggled to contain muscles bulging like overinflated balloons. Despite his size, he lacked any visible mechanical augmentations. However, a keen observer would notice that the index and middle fingers of both his hands were adorned with ring-type magic terminals. Yvette Reshivia took a moment to study him, her eyebrows lifting slightly in curiosity. A normal person would never need 4 magic terminals unless they had a specific requirement for them, such as using them as storage tools for complex magical formulas. The term cyber mage immediately sprang to Yvette's mind. Unlike her own fabricated identity, the man before her was the real deal. He likely followed the active rune group path favored by Black Tower Pharmaceuticals, perhaps even utilizing rune's secret medicines to enhance his physical form. Strictly speaking, he was more of a biochemical or mutant mage. The giant spoke with a voice that was surprisingly refined and gentle, contrasting sharply with his rugged, fierce appearance. He introduced himself, saying, "I am the one in charge here. The brothers on the street call me Welder. Beautiful mage, how should I address you?" Yvette didn't bother inventing a new alias, as this was merely a dream. She replied calmly, "Yvette Scene." Welder nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Miss Scene, my subordinates tell me you wish to conduct business here." When Yvette confirmed with a simple yes, Welder gestured for them to follow him. "In that case, please, come inside so we can talk." Yvette gave a faint hum of agreement and stepped forward. Though she appeared to be nothing more than a delicate, beautiful young girl, her composed aura made Welder take notice. On this planet, strength could be bought with enough money, but true presence and inner depth only came with the passage of time. This girl was neither arrogant nor timid, leading him to wonder about her true age. He suspected she might be 40 or 50 years old, preserved by some high-end longevity rune medicine. They followed Welder into the shelter, passing through a crude underground corridor riddled with bullet holes. As the roar of the market grew louder, Yvette and Rosalyn Scene finally laid eyes on the subterranean exchange. Heated gun barrels glowed with a faint blue light on various stalls, and the hum of lightning blades cut through the air. Most were obsolete rune weapons, but they were more than enough for the average person, with prices fluctuating between thousands and tens of thousands of credits. In a corner of the hall filled with coarse shouting, Rosalyn noticed more dangerous transactions involving addictive substances. When she looked over, she was met with filthy, lecherous glares that made her quickly stiffen her expression, desperately trying to mimic her master's nonchalance. Welder led them to his private meeting room, which was essentially a cage enclosed by explosion-proof steel plates. He sat on a sofa inside the cage, ignoring the chaotic noise outside as he poured 3 cups of coffee. He pushed 2 toward his guests and asked, "Are you too new to the Black Water District?" Steam rose from the cups, carrying a faint scent of bitter almonds mixed with chemical additives. Yvette signaled Rosalyn not to touch the drink before giving a slight nod. "Yes, we are." Welder leaned back. "Then, what kind of transaction are you looking for?" Yvette spoke with a flat, even tone. "I want to purchase secure, new identity ID cards and pirated professional books on rune knowledge. Additionally, I would like a stall here to sell some of my original restricted spells, or perhaps take on commissions for rune compilation." Welder suddenly burst into laughter as if he had heard something incredibly amusing. He took a sip of his coffee and wiped his mouth. "I can get you the ID cards, but pirated books?" He let out a sharp scoff. Last year, a gang tried to sell bootleg introductory textbooks from Black Tower Middle School. In less than a month, every single one of them vanished. To this day, no one knows where their bodies are. A flicker of surprise crossed Yvette's calm face. She knew from her readings that the Origin civilization was strict about piracy, but this sounded far more severe than she had imagined. Rosalyn asked in shock, "That serious? Why?" Welder squinted at them. "Because it infringes on the corporate intellectual property. That's how they make their money while sitting on their backsides. They protect it fiercely." He paused, noticing Yvette's reaction. "Mage, surely you knew this." Yvette looked at him with eyes that were as still and silent as a stagnant pool. For reasons he couldn't explain, Welder felt a sudden chill run down his spine, and his lingering doubts about her identity as a high-level cyber mage evaporated instantly. He didn't realize that Yvette was actually sighing in frustration internally. When she had been browsing the net the night before, she had seen a patent book titled Elemental Decay Completion Technology sold by Cindertrace Chemical. The price for a single ebook was 500,000 credits. She had hoped to find a cheaper, illegal version, but now she realized that even the black market feared dealing in pirated knowledge. At this rate, it would take forever to save enough money through legitimate channels. Welder shifted the subject, leaning forward with a grin. "However, your original spells are a rare commodity. I might be able to facilitate some deals for you. Most gangs would be very interested. The standard cut here is 20%, but for you, I'll only take 10. Does that sound fair? Once I've verified the goods, I'll start making connections." Eager to start earning, Yvette agreed. She recalled that the e-commerce platforms of her previous life took a similar commission, so the offer seemed genuine. Welder's smile deepened. He wasn't lying about the discount. To him, the connections of a high-level mage who could create original restricted spells were far more valuable than a few extra credits. He was a novice cyber mage himself, but he could barely cast existing spells, let alone create or even tweak them for fear of a bug causing a fatal explosion. To prove her worth, Yvette decided to sell a spell she called Arcane Windblade YH47254, the same technique she had used to kill the 3 thugs the day before. The prefix YH stood for the Black Water District of Ish City, and the numbers represented the rune count. Welder raised an eyebrow, remarking that the name sounded common, but he led them to a larger room containing an old, yellowed machine. The machine was a spell simulator, used to stress test the performance of magical formulas. Although Yvette had read about them in the Abyss base, this was her first time seeing one in person. She felt a strange surge of nerves, like a student about to take a final exam. She had been designing runes for centuries, but she had never had her work officially benchmarked. She worried that her self-taught methods might result in a low score, especially since she hadn't fully optimized this particular spell. After Yvette performed a thorough check of the machine system to ensure there were no hidden data theft programs, she initiated the test. The machine began to shake, and a message appeared on the screen stating that it was testing rune quality. Rosalyn watched with wide eyes, asking what that meant. Since the machine had a voice broadcast enabled for the illiterate, Welder explained that it was measuring redundancy. Magic formulas often contain garbage runes that serve no purpose but to slow down the casting time, Welder explained to the young girl. The more complex the spell, the more garbage it usually has. This test calculates the percentage of redundant runes and compares it to other spells of the same class to give a grade. The top 5% get an S rank, the top 10% get an A, and so on. As Welder finished his explanation, the first phase of the test concluded. A massive, glowing letter S appeared on the screen. A collective gasp came from the doorway, where several of Welder's thugs had gathered to watch the commotion. Welder himself stood frozen in shock. While rune quality was only one part of the overall score, achieving an S rank was incredibly difficult. It meant the compiler was either a genius who could write perfect code in one go or a complete perfectionist. Looking at Yvette's silver hair and her calm, simple attire, he began to realize he was dealing with someone truly extraordinary. When the S-rank rating for rune quality lit up on the screen, Welder found his doubts about the mediocre name Arcane Windblade beginning to vanish. However, the second test for stability made his breath hitch in his throat. The screen displayed a notification stating that stability calculations were in progress. This metric represented the probability of a spell collapsing, twisting, or failing due to internal flaws, often exacerbated by the caster's technique or the environment. In high-pressure situations or elementally polluted zones, stability was far more critical than mere quality. No mage wanted their magic to spontaneously combust in their hands. After a tense moment, a bold letter A flashed onto the display. Welder murmured the grade under his breath, his gaze drifting toward Yvette. While it wasn't an S, an A rank in stability placed the spell in the top 10% of all known sequences. He wondered if she truly was a top-tier rune compiler. He glanced at the mage, but Yvette remained expressionless and composed, so he turned his attention back to the final metrics. The third indicator was the mana consumption ratio, the most vital performance metric of all. It measured the art of using internal mana to leverage external forces, representing the efficiency of every single point of energy spent. When the result flashed another S rank, Welder couldn't contain himself. He took a deep, shaky breath. It was his first time seeing an S rank efficiency on a medium-sized spell with nearly 50,000 runes. If this woman wasn't a master, he didn't know who was. Even the thugs at the door, who knew nothing of runes, sensed the shift in the room and began whispering among themselves. One asked why the boss looked like he had seen a ghost, while another snapped back that it was because they were witnessing a masterpiece. Rosalyn stood by, the only one who remained perfectly calm. She had more confidence in the arcane wind blade than Yvette herself. To her, these results were exactly what she expected from her master. She thought to herself with a swell of pride, "This is my master's work. Of course it's incredible. And I am her only student." As the testing moved past the most technical hurdles, everyone in the room expected a perfect S-rank composite score to appear. But then, the final category for safety and security appeared, and the result was a dismal J-rank. The atmosphere in the room froze, replaced by a sense of profound absurdity. Welder looked completely baffled. He asked with confusion, "Miss Mage, what is this?" He couldn't believe a master who could achieve an S rank in efficiency would fail so spectacularly in security. It was the kind of amateur mistake he would make. He even wondered if the machine was broken. Yvette remained silent for a moment before she admitted quite frankly, "My apologies. I forgot to include a firewall or any anti-hijacking designs." Welder was speechless. For a top-tier cybermage to forget something so fundamental was like a genius student forgetting to write their name on a final exam. Yvette thought for a second and offered to fix it, noting it would take some time. But Welder suddenly interrupted, saying that it was actually better this way. The final composite score settled at an A- due to the 0 in security. Even so, it was the highest-rated spell to ever pass through the Junkyard Black Market. Welder explained with a hint of a smirk that most of his clients were local gang leaders. He noted that while they were mages, their skills were barely enough to read a spell, let alone perform a high-level spell hijack. To them, security features were a redundant luxury. He chuckled ruefully and told her that an A- was already too extravagant for them. He suggested that if she could actually downgrade the spell to a B-, they would probably be even happier. Yvette stared at him, momentarily stunned. After years of optimizing rune sets, this was the first time she had ever been asked to make something worse. However, she didn't want to argue in a dream, so she simply told him she would allow him to sell it at a B-rank price. Welder's eyes lit up with greed. S-rank performance at a B-rank price was an incredible deal. He immediately began thinking about buying a few copies for himself. His long-dormant ambition began to stir as he realized the profit potential. The testing wasn't entirely over, as specialized tests for penetration, area of effect, and range followed, all confirming the spell was a statistical monster. However, they hit a snag at the final step, encrypted packaging. This was a massive technical undertaking that Yvette had never encountered before. Welder sighed and pulled up a holographic interface, suggesting they use the remote encryption service from Black Tower Pharmaceuticals. He explained it cost 5,000 credits per pack and could be paid in digital currency. Yvette hesitated, noting she only had 2,800 credits to her name. Welder laughed and explained that Black Tower's encryption was nearly impossible to crack because it bound the spell to the user's soul. More importantly, he lowered his voice and added that no one dared to crack it because Black Tower was the emperor of Ish Island. Yvette looked at him and asked if he could cover the cost for 5 packs. Because the mage was short on funds, Welder ended up advancing the fees. He purchased 2 of the finished packages on the spot for 50,000 credits each. After deducting the 25,000 credit encryption fee, he transferred 75,000 to Yvette. Including her previous balance, she now had 77,800 credits. It was a good start, though still far from the 500,000 she needed for the elemental decay completion technology. As they prepared to leave, Welder personally escorted them through the long, dark air raid shelters. The yellowed lights flickered, casting shadows over old bullet holes in the rock walls. Seeing Rosalyn's curiosity, Welder smiled and explained that the residents of Pixel Street had dug these tunnels by hand 20 years ago during the Silent War. He kicked a loose stone aside and reminisced about how he was only a small child back then, hiding in these tunnels and eating compressed biscuits while the corporate alliance and global international fought for control. Yvette wasn't familiar with the details of the Silent War, as she hadn't prioritized historical data after the apocalypse. She only knew it was a long conflict between 8 supercorporations and the world government. Welder listed the corporations for them: Black Tower Pharmaceuticals, Lingman Company, Sky Tech, Lintui Biotech, Gravity Group, Cindertrace Chemical, Rift Void Group, and Black Tide. He sneered, calling them the 8 new kings of the planet. When Yvette asked how the war ended, Welder admitted that no one really knew. Both sides had suddenly announced a truce with no clear winner, even though the government forces had the upper hand at the time. He mentioned that thousands of conspiracy theories existed, ranging from mind control to alien invasions. Yvette frowned and asked about the rumors of doomsday weapons. Welder recalled stories of a superbomb capable of destroying the world if sent to the planet's core, which supposedly forced the government to stand down. Yvette shook her head silently, thinking that she had expected something like a mutation virus instead. She made a mental note to look for more information on the Silent War while she was still within the dream. Before leaving the black market, Yvette made sure to place an order with Welder for 2 clean, legitimate ID cards. Securing these required navigating the corrupt channels of the local police department, but as a dominant figure in the area, Welder handled the request with ease. In reality, the police were the ones selling the identities. He was merely the middleman facilitating the transaction. Through her conversations with the biochemical mage, Yvette had begun to suspect that the IDs might not even be necessary. Unless the friends or family of the 3 thugs she had eliminated were willing to bribe the police heavily, the local authorities were far too lazy to conduct a real investigation. They would likely file a perfunctory report and move on, never noticing that their systems had been breached or that resident data had been altered. The Blackwater district was home to countless unsolved mysteries and cold cases. Aside from the occasional idealistic rookie, most officers were cynical veterans who wouldn't lose a wink of sleep over another missing person. Still, Yvette had only been in this world for 2 days. She lacked a deep understanding of the district, the city, and the origin civilization as a whole. Relying on theory alone was a dangerous game. For the sake of caution, she paid 16,000 credits for the 2 cards, watching her balance dip to 69,800. As evening fell, Yvette took Rosalyn on a tour of the city center. They moved through the sprawling greenery of a civic park that had been transformed into a private estate after the apocalypse, enjoyed an expensive dinner, and eventually ascended to the observation dome atop the Black Tower Pharmaceuticals building. From that height, the neon lights of Ish City stretched out below them like a sea of electric fire, with rivers of magical energy pulsing through the streets. Rosalyn gazed at the breathtaking view, her eyes wide with wonder. To her, this was the literal manifestation of a kingdom of the gods, a place where all her dreams of a better world seemed to come true. Yvette, however, knew better. She understood that no utopia existed, and that the origin civilization was a society fractured by a staggering gap between the rich and the poor. Yet, even she found herself momentarily lost in the beauty of the lights. The scene triggered a sharp pang of nostalgia, reminding her of the time she had visited the top of the Shanghai Tower with her family. Back then, she had been young and full of ambition, never imagining that she would end up delivering food for a living after graduation. Fate had taken a strange turn, and now she was a witch in a dying world. She couldn't decide if she was lucky or cursed. The next morning, Yvette used an agency platform to move out of their temporary lodging. She rented an 80-square-meter apartment in the Wright apartment building, located on Acid Street. The building was situated near a thriving commercial hub in the Blackwater district. The location was prime, and the security was significantly more reliable than what they had experienced on Pixel Street. Here, one could sleep through the night without being jolted awake by the sound of gunfire. Yvette looked up at their new home, noting the massive, bright yellow honeycomb structure. The upper section of the building flared outward, where maglev vehicles hummed as they landed and took off from rooftop platforms. The lower section was more conservative, with narrow windows reinforced by wire mesh and a single, guarded driveway. Leading Rosalyn into the elevator, Yvette pressed the button for the 18th floor. This was a VIP lift reserved for tenants on the upper levels, where the rent was higher and the services were more refined. As they reached Unit 1809 and unlocked the door, a middle-aged man in a white lab coat stepped out from the neighboring apartment. He looked as though he were heading out for the day, but he paused to offer a surprised greeting, asking, "Hello there. Are you the new neighbors?" Yvette gave a slight, polite nod and replied, "Yes, we just moved in today." The man smiled warmly and reached into his pocket, producing a small slip of paper. He introduced himself, saying, "I am Regil Hoffman. It looks like we'll be neighbors from now on. Here is my business card. Feel free to reach out if you ever need any help." Yvette glanced at the card, noting the name Hoffman General Clinic. She looked back at him and asked, "You're a doctor?" Regil nodded and assured her, "I am. My rates are quite affordable, so don't worry. Many of the tenants on the upper floors are my regular patients." He checked his watch and waved a quick goodbye, adding, "I'm running a bit late, so I must be off. Enjoy your new home." Once he had disappeared down the hall, Yvette entered the apartment and the door slid shut with a soft click. Rosalyn had already rushed inside, fascinated by a holographic display disguised as a fish tank. Her interest was fleeting, however. Within minutes, she had lost her drive to explore and collapsed onto the living room sofa. She activated her MagTech terminal and began mindlessly scrolling through short videos, looking very much like a salted fish that had given up on life. Yvette shook her head at the sight and found a chair to sit in. She also went online, but her intentions were far from recreational. She began a deep dive into the archives concerning the Silent War. Information about the global conflict was abundant and easy to find, though much of it was contradictory. According to the verified entries in the digital encyclopedias, the war had begun with startling suddenness. There had been no diplomatic buildup or warnings. The government forces had launched a preemptive strike, catching the corporations off guard. In the early stages, the corporate factions were clearly at a disadvantage. Yvette noted that only 3 major entities were initially involved: Lingman Company, Sky Tech, and Black Tower Pharmaceuticals. The aggressors were the new Eden United States and the future Union, the 2 most powerful nations of the Origin civilization. The conflict had escalated from policy restrictions and regulatory interventions to small-scale armed skirmishes, eventually drawing in other powers until the world was engulfed in a total war between the corporate alliance and global international. It was a logical progression, Yvette thought. Attempting to curb the expansion of supercorporations was a standard political move, even if the methods used here were exceptionally violent. The conclusion of the war remained as Welder had described it. Both sides had abruptly declared a truce, citing a desire to avoid further casualties. Since then, a wall of silence had been maintained by all parties involved, which was how the conflict earned its name. Yvette spent the entire day sifting through mountains of theories and conspiracy stories, but by evening she was no closer to the truth. Her head throbbed, and she rubbed her temples in frustration. Even if a genuine clue existed, it was buried under layers of internet fiction. Deciding to change her approach, she stopped searching for the war and began looking for keywords related to the apocalypse. This narrowed the results significantly. After navigating several forums with the help of AI search engines, a specific post caught her eye. A user named Firebearer claimed that the end of the world was imminent and that they had established a shelter. The purpose of the post was to encourage people to contribute their most vital knowledge to a central server, serving as a seed for the rebirth of human civilization. On Earth, such a post would have been dismissed as a scam or a prank, but in the origin civilization, where intellectual property laws were enforced with terrifying severity, Firebearer's request felt strangely sincere. No one would risk imprisonment just to post a hoax of this nature. Intrigued, Yvette clicked on the suspicious link attached to the post. A security warning immediately flashed across her screen. She expertly bypassed the risk alert and continued to the site. A dark web page appeared, centered around an animation of a flickering candle. Below the graphic was an upload module for submitting files. In the upper left corner, a logo of a burning candle sat next to the name of the organization, the Civilization Preservation Society. Civilization Preservation Society? Yvette whispered the name to herself, her eyes fixed on the glowing terminal. She decided to initiate a hack immediately. Part of her wanted to see if this organization was legitimate or just another elaborate scam, but another part was eyeing the potential data harvest. There was likely a wealth of information stored on their servers, and she relished the idea of a digital $0 shopping spree. To her surprise, the intrusion was blocked almost as soon as it began. This wasn't the clunky, static firewall she had encountered at the Blackwater District Police Station. This was a dynamic defense system with vanishingly few exploitable vulnerabilities. Every time she managed to claw her way inside, her access credentials would be revoked in less than a second. It felt less like a standard system breach and more like a high-speed duel. The defense had a certain rhythm to it, a sense of intuition that felt far too human to be an AI. It was as if she were facing a top-tier rune hacker. After a moment of careful consideration, Yvette decisively withdrew. A normal hack was like playing chess against a machine, but this felt like there was a living, breathing opponent sitting across the board. Despite her use of jump points, spoofed addresses, and traffic obfuscation, she didn't want to risk them tracing her back to her physical location. She had no desire for someone to come knocking on her door. She set the mysterious organization and its elite security aside for the time being. To avoid drawing unnecessary attention, Yvette settled into a quiet, peaceful routine over the next month. Business with Welder was proceeding exactly as planned. The arcane Windblade scrolls had proven popular. Aside from the one she kept for herself, the remaining 4 packages had been snatched up by a single local gang leader. The sale brought in 200,000 credits, putting her significantly closer to the 500,000 needed for the book on elemental decay completion technology. With some downtime on her hands and an eye toward future needs, Yvette decided to reach out to her neighbor. She added Regil Hoffman's professional account using the contact information on his business card. "Good morning, Mr. Hoffman," Yvette said as the holographic display flickered to life. Regil looked up at the screen, his expression one of genuine surprise. "Good morning. Oh, Miss Scene, is there something I can help you with?" Over the past month, the neighbors had become quite familiar. Regil, his wife Susan, and their children Hans and Mary often exchanged warm greetings with Yvette and Rosalyn in the hallways or on the streets below. Because of their similar ages, Rosalyn had become fast friends with the Hoffman children. As for Yvette, despite her youthful appearance, her mature and composed demeanor had led Regil and Susan to treat the silver-haired girl as a peer. "It's like this, Mr. Hoffman," Yvette began. "I've had some free time lately and have been reading books related to potions. I've developed a strong interest in medicine. I was wondering if you would be willing to offer some guidance or perhaps allow me to observe your treatment process." She paused before adding, "I am, of course, prepared to pay a reasonable tuition fee." Rune medicine was actually Yvette's second-largest field of knowledge, thanks to the extensive library at the Abyss base. Many of those texts were classified internal secrets of the Black Tower. She hadn't focused on them during her escape, but now that she had the time, she wanted to digest that information properly. Regil hesitated, looking conflicted. Well, Miss Scene, it's not that I don't want to teach you, but I don't have a teaching certificate. Even if I did, such instruction usually has to take place within a professional educational institution." "I only require the opportunity to observe," Yvette countered calmly. "Would 20,000 credits a month be acceptable?" Regil swallowed hard, the number hanging in the air. He was practicing medicine without a license, a fact known to most residents of the Wright apartment building and Acid Street. Because of his status, he charged very little. While other doctors of his caliber earned around 70,000 credits a month, he barely cleared 20,000. This girl was offering to double his monthly income just to watch him work. Even with the risk of illegally spreading knowledge, the reward was too great to ignore. He was already operating outside the law. One more infraction wouldn't change much, and his patients were loyal enough to keep his secrets. "Very well, Miss Scene," Regil said with a self-deprecating smile. "I'll send you a message whenever I have a consultation or a house call. Does that work for you?" "That would be perfect. Thank you very much, Mr. Hoffman," Yvette replied with a polite nod. Later that afternoon, a patient arrived at the Hoffman clinic complaining of persistent tinnitus. Yvette walked over to the small clinic attached to the neighbor's home. She was greeted warmly by Susan, who had set out a small table laden with snacks. It felt less like a medical internship and more like a high-end tea party. Yvette understood Susan's hospitality. To the Hoffmans, she was now a major benefactor. Their children, Hans and Mary, attended Black Tower Middle School, an elite institution with an annual tuition of 300,000 credits. Even with Regil working constantly and Susan taking on odd jobs, they were buried under student loans and predatory interest rates. Their quality of life was arguably lower than the workers in the Blackwater district. As Yvette watched the treatment, Rosalyn stepped through the door. She greeted everyone politely, then turned to Susan. "Master, Auntie Susan, are Hans and Mary around?" "They went out this morning," Susan said kindly. "Were you looking to play with them?" "Yes," Rosalyn replied with a sweet smile. Since her arrival in this world, these were the first friends she had made, and she spent most of her free time wandering the city with them. "Wait, let me check," Susan said, opening her Magitech terminal. She pulled up a family security service that tracked the children's real-time locations. Her brow furrowed in confusion. "They seem to be at Scrap Metal Avenue. That's 5 kilometers away. What are those two doing all the way out there?" She tried to call them, but the line was disconnected. "They aren't picking up, those children." Worry began to cloud Susan's face. "I hope they haven't run into any trouble." "Don't worry, Auntie Susan. I'm sure they're fine," Rosalyn said, glancing at Yvette for approval. Seeing Yvette's slight nod, Rosalyn headed for the door. "I'll go check on them right now." She hurried downstairs to hail a taxi for Scrap Metal Avenue. The twilight was drenched in the rusty reflection of metal, the setting sun melting into a smear of gold across the distant horizon. As Rosalyn's small boots stepped onto the cracked pavement, the taxi behind her hummed and lifted into the air, startling a few seabirds that had been scavenging through the nearby trash. Her gaze immediately fell upon the junkyard adjacent to the town. Mountains of discarded magical equipment rose up like a vast, mechanical graveyard. According to the local residents, this had once been one of the most prosperous areas of Ish Island and its only functioning port. However, with the construction of the new port in the Tower District and the neighboring Greyport City, the harbor in the Blackwater District had slowly withered away. It was finally abandoned, entirely 20 years ago during the Silence War. Since this wasn't her first time visiting, Rosalyn gathered her skirts and skillfully wove through the towering peaks of metallic waste. She quickly located a clearing hidden deep within the mechanical mountains. Hans and Mary were there, just as she expected, sitting on a sheet of metal plating as if waiting for someone. Rosalyn waved and called out, "Hi, you two, good afternoon." Hans looked over, his expression shifting to one of pure shock. "Wait, Rosalyn, what are you doing here?" Mary adjusted her glasses and spoke up from his side. "It's definitely because you hung up on Mom earlier. She has a tracker on your phone, you know." Hans and Mary were close in age to Rosalyn, 12 and 11 respectively, and were both middle school students. Hans was a refined-looking boy with medium-length brown hair, while Mary was a girl with curly red hair and round glasses. Though she didn't possess Rosalyn's striking beauty, she carried herself with an air of quiet intelligence. "Aunt Susan is very worried about you," Rosalyn said, her voice calm but her underlying meaning clear. "Why did you come here so suddenly without saying a word? I didn't even know." Hans lowered his voice, looking a bit sheepish. "Today, there's a special situation. I challenged someone to a fight, and I didn't want to get you involved." "A fight?" Rosalyn asked, her eyebrows rising. Mary stepped in to explain the situation. "It's like this. My brother and I have a few good friends at school who also come from the Blackwater district to study at Black Tower Middle School. We usually look out for each other. One of them, Tangjai, is always being bullied by a guy in his class named Brielle. Hans happened to run into them recently and stopped it, but the master arrived too quickly for anything to actually happen. Mary sighed, her frustration evident. It was clearly Brielle's fault. He's always discriminating against students from the Blackwater district. But his father is an executive at Black Tower Pharmaceuticals, so the masters refused to do anything about it. Then, he challenged Hans to come out here this weekend and settle it with a fight. Rosalyn nodded slowly. The situation wasn't complicated. In fact, it seemed like typical middle school drama. However, it carried a heavier weight when one considered the context. Black Tower Middle School was an elite institution designed to serve the children of corporate employees. On one side were the children of the slums, and on the other were the children of executives. Even when the executive's child was clearly in the wrong, the masters could only try to smooth things over, leading to these kinds of off-campus resolutions. Rosalyn felt a flicker of understanding. This was what the masters called a class conflict. Looking around the desolate clearing, Rosalyn realized someone was missing. Where is Tangjai? Mary curled her lip in a sneer. He's a coward. Hans is helping him, but he didn't even dare to show up. No, Tangjai said his family wouldn't let him come, Hans countered, a look of firm conviction appearing on his scholarly face. I believe he wasn't lying to me. Mary opened her mouth to argue, but then went silent. She understood Tangjai's position. Her parents worked themselves to the bone just to afford the tuition so she and Hans could attend Black Tower Middle School. Their goal was for their children to join Black Tower Pharmaceuticals, to stand atop the Black Tower building at the very peak of Ish City. Tangjai's parents undoubtedly felt the same. For children of this age, those massive expectations transformed into crushing mental pressure, making them timid and terrified of causing any trouble for their parents. The three of them waited in the silence of the junkyard for about 10 minutes. Finally, a contemptuous voice drifted down from above. "Heh, you actually dared to show up, you pauper." Rosalyn looked up to see a boy about their age standing on a floating skateboard, looking down at them with a sneer. Two thin, smaller boys followed behind him like lackeys, accompanied by a hovering mechanical construct. The machine consisted only of an upper torso, with glowing rune rings swirling around its base. It appeared to be some kind of intelligent bodyguard. Hans let out a cold laugh. "Who's afraid of you? Don't forget, my grades in rune studies are higher than yours." Rune studies was a subject that most commoners only had the right to touch once they reached the legendary university level. It was the true beginning of the path of a mage. But at Black Tower Middle School, it was different. Starting from the second year, these students, most of whom were children of company employees, had the opportunity to learn it. All they had to do was purchase a discounted active rune set to enroll. Hans had already started, and Mary would do the same next year. However, these sets were incredibly expensive. Even the cheapest variety cost 50,000 credits for a single injection that raised mana by 10 points, and the effects diminished with every use. "Rune studies is one thing, but actual combat is another," Brielle said as he glided down the side of a trash mountain and hopped off his board. "You know nothing about the power of my fists, pauper." Brielle's gaze swept over Hans and Mary before landing on the unfamiliar blonde girl. He asked coldly, "Who are you? What school do you go to? Did this pauper bring you here to save face?" He was suspicious. Rosalyn had an air about her that he had never seen in anyone from the Blackwater district. Every movement, the way she sat and stood, possessed a natural elegance that felt out of place in the junkyard. Rosalyn gave a slight nod. "My name is Rosalyn. I am a friend of Hans. I won't interfere in this matter, provided that your conflict doesn't go too far." One of the lackeys behind Brielle immediately began to shout. "You've got a big mouth, woman. Who do you think you are, acting like you have the right to interfere with the boss?" "Just wait," the other lackey chimed in. "The boss is going to show this kid what's what, and you're going to have a front row seat." Brielle smiled, clearly enjoying having his underling speak for him. He turned his attention back to Hans. "Since we're dueling here, what are the rules?" "It's a fight, what rules do we need?" Hans said dismissively. "No tools other than your magical terminal, that's it." Let's add a wager then, Brielle suggested with a cruel glint in his eyes. The loser has to crawl and bark like a dog in the school courtyard in front of everyone. Otherwise, this is boring. Unless, of course, you're too scared. You think I'd be afraid of you, Hans snapped. With the bet settled, the onlookers moved back to clear the space between the mountains of scrap. Hans and Brielle prepared to face off in a tense, magical battle. Rosalyn watched with bated breath. Beyond her worry for Hans, she was eager to see this. It was the first time she would see mages other than her masters in action. It would be the perfect reference for a novice like herself, allowing her to finally understand where she stood compared to her peers. Crush him, boss! The two lackeys shouted from their perch on a mountain of scrap metal, acting as a makeshift cheerleading squad. Show this Blackwater trash what for. In the center of the clearing, which was roughly the size of a basketball court, a flash of emerald light flickered across the two combatants. To Rosalyn's utter shock, the two boys, supposedly entry-level mages, immediately fell into a messy, physical brawl. They kicked at each other's stomachs and swung wild punches at foreheads, looking more like toddlers in a playground tiff than practitioners of the mystic arts. Rosalyn stood frozen, her expectations of a grand magical duel shattered. This was nothing like the elegant displays she had imagined. It was just a common street fight. The only hint of magic was the occasional rune circle that shimmered briefly against their skin, suggesting they were using basic body enhancement spells to boost their stamina or durability. She sighed to herself, wondering how she was supposed to learn anything from this. These were the elite students of Black Tower Middle School, yet their level seemed so primitive compared to the high-level techniques Yvette had taught her. She realized then that in this world, knowledge was a strictly guarded commodity. Without paying for expensive, official tutorials, even talented students were limited to the most basic spells. Her own strength didn't come from natural genius, but from the fact that her mentor provided her with S-rank spells for free. The fight reached its climax as Hans managed to wrap his arm around Brielle's neck in a tight chokehold. His veins bulged with effort as he squeezed. Mary pumped her fist in the air, shouting, "That's it, brother, get him." Suddenly, the ground beneath them groaned and shook violently. A massive pillar of fire erupted 200 meters away, painting the sky in shades of bruised orange and crimson. The shockwave followed an instant later, sending jagged shards of metal raining down around the clearing. Hans didn't let go, his voice strained as he asked, "What's going on?" Brielle, sensing the shift in the air, looked toward his lackeys and commanded, "Go see what happened." A minute later, the two boys returned on their hoverboards, their faces pale with terror. "Boss, it's a gang war," one of them screamed. "The gangs are fighting right here. We have to leave." The word gang acted like a cold bucket of water. Hans immediately released his grip, allowing Brielle to scramble away. Brielle gasped for air, his arrogance replaced by fear as he wheezed, "This doesn't count. We're leaving." Mary wasn't ready to let it go, mocking him by saying, "Doesn't count. You were about to lose. You just want to get out of barking like a dog." Brielle ignored her, stepping onto his floating skateboard to flee with his bodyguards. But before they could move, a searing bolt of fire struck the ground directly in front of them. The impact sent them tumbling into a heap. Rosalyn looked up to see a man with a bare chest standing atop the debris, grinning down at them. He held a rune-etched rifle, and the dark, bone-like armor covering his torso pulsed with a sinister light. Rosalyn recognized the gear as a form of colonial bioaugmentation, a living magical armor that fed on its host. The man laughed, his voice raspy as he said, "We were just hitting the gutter gang, but look at this unexpected harvest." Hans tried to keep his voice steady, stepping forward as a local who knew the rules of the streets. "We're just passing through. My father is Dr. Hoffman from Acid Street. He's treated your people before." The gangster spat on the ground and sneered, "Acid Street? That's Skeleton Brotherhood territory. What does that have to do with us in the Mad Dog Gang?" A second man appeared, his arm covered in a pulsing green vine-like prosthetic. He looked at the children and his eyes lit up with greed. "Forget the gutter gang, Rouville," the first man said to his partner. "Look at these kids. Hoverboards, guardian golems. Their parents must be loaded. We could get at least 1,000,000 credits for each of them." Panic set in. Brielle, his face white as a sheet, screamed, My father is the operations director at Black Tower Pharmaceuticals. You can't do this to me. The man named Tai Pai's expression turned murderous. Black Tower Pharmaceuticals? He growled, raising his rifle. I hate company dogs more than anything. Do you know how much they charged me for a 3-minute consultation? 8,000 credits. I'll kill you right now. As Tai Pai leveled his weapon at the trembling Brielle, a sudden, unnatural gale tore through the junkyard. The wind whipped up clouds of dust and metal scraps, creating a blinding screen that knocked the gangsters off balance. Run, Rosalyn commanded. She grabbed Hans and Mary, her movements blurred by the wind she had summoned. She snatched up Brielle's discarded hoverboard and pulled the others toward it. The gangsters tried to fire through the dust, but their shots were intercepted by Brielle's guardian golem. Rosalyn didn't stop there. She traced 2 crimson rune circles in the air, unleashing a twin burst of flames. It was a junior version of the flame dance she had learned, but it was enough to create a wall of fire between them and their pursuers. With the wind-enhanced hoverboard beneath them, Rosalyn pushed her mana to the limit. The board surged forward with a violent burst of speed, outrunning the magical bullets trailing behind them. In a flash of teal light, they vanished behind a mountain of scrap, leaving the enraged shouts of the mad dog gang far behind. I was scared to death. I almost lost my life back there. One of the teenagers cried out, his voice cracking with the lingering adrenaline of their narrow escape. I can't believe it, another whispered, staring at Rosalyn with a mixture of awe and disbelief. We actually have a real mage in our group. The group of students had just scrambled through a massive, damp drainage pipe, emerging onto a secluded stretch of coastline on the far side of Iron Scrap Avenue. As they caught their breath, their eyes remained fixed on Rosalyn, who walked at the head of the pack. They were the elite of Black Tower Middle School, and they knew exactly how impossible her display of magic had been. Even third-year seniors couldn't have pulled off a feat like that while under fire. Rosalyn turned back to them, a playful but firm glint in her eyes. She pressed a finger to her lips and winked, saying, "Can we keep this a little secret between us?" Hans, Mary, and even Brielle nodded frantically. They had seen enough terror for one day. Their only desire now was to crawl back to the safety of their homes. Brielle muttered under his breath, his face twisted in a scowl, "Those damn mad dogs. They destroyed my golem. Just wait until I tell my parents. I'll make them pay for this." "What do we do now?" a timid lackey asked, glancing nervously at the darkening shoreline where the waves crashed rhythmically against the rocks. Hans looked around, his expression serious. "Let's keep moving. We're still too close to the graveyard. We need to find a place to lay low for a while." Rosalyn led them toward a destination she and the Hoffmans had discovered during their recent explorations, a weathered seaside village. It was a place forgotten by gangs and tourists alike, inhabited only by a few elderly residents waiting out their final days. As they approached a small wooden shack by the water, they saw a silver-haired man sitting nearby, peacefully casting a fishing line into the surf. He looked up and offered a warm, crinkled smile. "Grandpa Watt," Rosalyn called out, waving her hand. Her voice startled a few seagulls, sending them fluttering into the sky with a chorus of sharp cries. The old man, Watt, squinted at the approaching group. "Well now, you've brought some new friends today. Are you here to catch some fish? Or perhaps you've developed a craving for some crispy pupae?" No, we're fine, thank you," Rosalyn replied quickly, her hands waving in dismissal. The crispy pupae Watt spoke of were a local delicacy, large, white grubs as thick as 2 fingers. When roasted, they shriveled into a crunchy, salty snack. To the youth of the Blackwater district, the sight of them was enough to turn their stomachs. "Crispy pupae?" Brielle asked, his voice dripping with disdain. "Are you one of the natives, old man?" Watt nodded, unbothered by Brielle's rudeness. "Most of the kingdom's descendants are still here, scattered around Iron Scrap Avenue. Some moved to Greyport or Luya City behind Mount Ish, though I don't know much about those places." Suddenly, one of Brielle's followers pointed toward the base of a nearby cliff. "What's that over there?" The group followed his gaze to a structure carved into the rock, resembling a grand entrance. "That," Watt said, his voice taking on a reverent tone, "is the Tide Church." "The Tide Church?" Rosalyn, Hans, and Mary exchanged surprised looks. They had visited this area several times but had never noticed it before. It was a place for ancient rituals, Watt explained with a chuckle. It's hidden when the tide is high and only reveals itself when the waters recede. Now, it's nothing more than a ruin. No one comes here except for the occasional archaeology enthusiast. What kind of god did they worship? Mary asked, her curiosity piqued. The god of twilight, Watt replied. In modern mythology, he's considered a demon god. But back then, the islanders saw him as the embodiment of death and rebirth. They sacrificed to him for thousands of years. I don't know the specifics, only what I've seen in old documentaries. It was all a very long time ago. The old man's eyes grew misty, as if he could see the ghosts of the past moving in and out of the church. The group stayed with Watt until evening, narrowly avoiding a gang patrol thanks to the old man's clever misdirection. Later that night, back in the safety of room 1809, Rosalyn recounted the day's events to her master. She finished her story with a hopeful note, asking, "So, master, how did I do today?" Arrogant, reckless, and impulsive, Yvette's voice rang out, cold and sharp. "And next time, you are to notify me immediately. Even if this is a dream, I cannot guarantee your safety in reality if something goes wrong here." "But I thought I handled it perfectly," Rosalyn protested, her pride stinging. "If you had notified me," Yvette countered, her tone even more severe than usual, "I could have used your connection to the network to hack the chips in their bodies. I could have caused interference or remotely hijacked nearby vehicles to crash into them. Wouldn't that have been safer than dodging bullets on a hoverboard?" Rosalyn fell silent, her mouth hanging open but no words coming out. Her master was right. In the heat of the moment, she had only thought about showing off her own skills. She hadn't considered the sheer stupidity of the risks she took. The shame intensified as she realized she had been looking forward to Yvette's praise all the way home. "I'm sorry, master," Rosalyn whispered after a long pause. "I was wrong." After dinner, Yvette turned her attention to the stories Rosalyn had shared about the Tide Church. She opened a holographic screen, which flickered to life with a soft hum, and began scouring her databases. She soon found a research paper explaining that figures like the God of Twilight appeared in almost every culture across the planet. Whether called the Twilight Lord or the Source of Destruction, the myths were strikingly similar. In every story, these entities destroyed the divine kingdom of Eden, forcing humanity to flee into a harsh world. Historians agreed that these legends were likely rooted in a prehistoric civilization from 30,000 years ago, a time of immense magical saturation that ended abruptly. Every living thing from that time perished, and the world entered a period of magical stagnation. "A turning point," Yvette murmured to herself, her digital eyes scanning the data. Could it be that the civilization from 30,000 years ago was also destroyed by a mysterious apocalypse? Is this all just one grand, tragic cycle? The high magic environment of the ancient civilization, coupled with the ubiquitous presence of dragons, had planted a seed of doubt in Yvette's mind regarding the nature of the radiant continent where Rosalyn originated. However, she quickly dismissed these suspicions. If the two worlds were truly one and the same, the origin of the very first aberrants remained a complete and utter mystery. For the next several days, Yvette set aside her research into the free mythological and historical archives. The sheer volume of data was like a vast, bottomless ocean, impossible to navigate in its entirety. Furthermore, her interest in the root cause of the prehistoric apocalypse was born of curiosity rather than a desperate need for answers. She found it far more productive to observe Dr. Regel's medical practice, playing the role of a young intern. After all, the tuition had already been paid in advance. As the days stretched on, a rumor began to circulate through the neighborhood about a stunningly beautiful girl with silver hair and crimson eyes working at the Hoffman Clinic. This gossip brought in a surge of new patients, and a line often stretched out the door. The Hoffmans were exhausted by the end of each day, but they were happy. The increased income meant they could pay off their children's student loans much faster than anticipated. But this peaceful interlude came to a jarring, violent end after only a month. One morning, 3 police officers arrived at the clinic. The news they brought hit the Hoffman family like a thunderbolt, shattering their hard-won tranquility. Someone had filed a report against Regel Hoffman for practicing medicine without a license. The officers were there to take him away for investigation. By the time evening fell and Hans and Mary returned from school to hear the news, the entire household was submerged in a sea of grief and despair. Rosalyn stood in her own home after returning from next door, her mind a blank void of confusion. She whispered to herself, "How could this happen?" It had happened so suddenly, leaving no room for anyone to prepare. Only yesterday, she had been laughing and chatting with Hans and Mary, sharing a warm dinner with Regil and Mrs. Susan. Now, those days were over. With the family's primary breadwinner gone, Susan could not possibly afford the exorbitant tuition for the Black Tower Middle School on her own. The best-case scenario was for the children to transfer to a public school, or worse, drop out entirely to find work. In the silence of their apartment, Yvette watched her disciple but did not offer any words of comfort. She thought to herself, one never knows which will come first, tomorrow or a catastrophe. She was powerless to intervene in this legal matter. If Regil had been framed, it would be one thing, but the charges were technically true. Worse yet, he had a history of purchasing and studying pirated runic knowledge, a far more dangerous offense. Without a massive bribe, he was looking at a minimum of 10 years in prison. A decade was long enough for Hans and Mary to miss the most critical stages of their lives, ensuring they would remain trapped in the poverty of the Blackwater district forever. Rosalyn looked up, her eyes pleading. "Master, is there any way we can help them?" She couldn't bear to watch her only two friends be swallowed by this vortex of suffering. Yvette replied bluntly, "It would be difficult. While not entirely impossible, there is no point. This is merely a dream." Her words were cold but factual. Money could bail Regil out, but Yvette had no idea when this dream state would end. She refused to waste the funds she needed for vital research on a fleeting illusion. It was a luxury she couldn't afford. Rosalyn froze, the realization sinking in. Oh, right, it's a dream. She had forgotten for a moment that she wasn't in the real world, but in a memory of a time long past. Nothing she did here could change the established facts of history. She fell silent, dropping her head in a state of profound dejection. The following afternoon, Rosalyn stood in the hallway of the Wright apartments and watched as Hans and Mary emerged from their home, their faces numb with shock. They were carrying cardboard boxes and loading them onto a small cart. She stepped forward and asked softly, "Where are you going?" Mary's voice was low, her eyes red and swollen from crying. Mom spoke with the building manager. "We're moving to a vacant room 15 floors down. We'll get a small refund on the rent this way." Hans tried to offer a reassuring smile, though it looked more like a grimace of pain. "Don't worry," he said. "We're still in the same building." Rosalyn didn't know what to say. She simply stepped in to help them carry their belongings. As they worked, she leaned in and whispered, Have you thought about who might have reported him?" Hans sighed, the weight of the world visible in the slump of his shoulders. "I don't know, the report was anonymous. And besides, what's the point of finding out now?" Rosalyn fell silent again. He was right. Finding the whistleblower wouldn't change the outcome. It was too late. She was simply struck by a sudden, impulsive curiosity. Did the person who did this understand the consequences of their actions? Did they feel even a shred of regret? A week passed. The electronic sign for the Hoffman Clinic flickered one last time before going dark as the final patient left with a heavy sigh. The small clinic, which had once been a beacon of hope, was officially closed. The news spread through the neighborhood like a funeral dirge. Many were shocked to learn that the skilled, affordable Dr. Hoffman had been unlicensed all along. Despite this, many neighbors brought gifts and offered their condolences, remembering the kindness he had shown them. Another week went by. Unable to afford a lawyer, Regil stood trial alone. Perhaps it was his cooperative attitude, or perhaps his stellar reputation earned him the jury's sympathy, but he received a relatively light sentence. Instead of the expected 10 years, he was given 6. It was still a devastating blow, but it was the best they could hope for. On the night of the sentencing, Rosalyn learned that Hans and Mary had applied for a school transfer. They could no longer afford the elite Black Tower Middle School and were moving to Blackwater Middle School, a third-rate institution at best. Mrs. Susan had set up a roadside stall on a noisy, filthy street corner, selling simple food to keep the family fed and pay the interest on their loans. This was the first time Rosalyn had witnessed the systematic destruction of a family. To her, the Hoffmans were good people who had done nothing wrong. Regil might have lacked a license, but his skills were real, and he had saved countless lives for a pittance. He deserved flowers, not handcuffs. Yet, a single anonymous report had destroyed them, and it had all been done legally and according to the rules. It didn't fit her image of the Origin civilization as an advanced, beautiful world. Standing by the window of room 1809, Rosalyn watched Susan's hunched figure working at the stall far below. She asked in a hollow voice, "Master, why is it like this?" Yvette didn't look up from her work as she replied, "This is simply how the world is. You just didn't see the whole picture at first." Rosalyn remained silent. As a 12-year-old girl from a primitive civilization, her idealized vision of this world had been stubborn. Even the sight of gang violence hadn't fully shattered her perspective. But now, she felt a growing sense of loathing for this place. "The Groany Clinic," Yvette said suddenly. Rosalyn blinked, pulled from her thoughts. "What was that, Master?" Yvette lowered her eyes and spoke calmly. "The Groany Clinic. The head physician is Goss Groany. He is the one who sent the anonymous report. If you want to know what he was thinking, you can go and ask him now." As night deepened, a bone-chilling autumn rain began to fall from the pitch-black sky. What started as a fine mist quickly turned into a steady downpour, drumming against the metal walls and cold glass of the city. Under the murky glow of the street lamps, the rain formed a shimmering, dismal curtain. The Groany Clinic was empty of patients. Only Goss Groany sat behind the counter, his legs propped up on the desk as he scrolled through holographic videos. When Rosalyn pushed the door open, he lowered his feet and asked, "Little girl, are you here for medicine or a consultation?" Rosalyn got straight to the point. "Are you Dr. Goss?" "I am," Goss said, a smile spreading across his face. "Have you heard of me?" "No," Rosalyn replied. "I want to know why you reported Mr. Hoffman." The smile vanished, replaced by a look of startled suspicion. Goss stood up from his stool and said coldly, "What report? What are you talking about? Who told you that? Did those paupers from the Hoffman family send you here to cause trouble?" "I know it was you," Rosalyn said, looking up at him. Though she was small and slender, she did not seem weak. "I just want to know why." Goss let out a sharp, mocking laugh. After a moment of thought, he answered, "Why? For justice, of course." "Justice?" Rosalyn repeated, the word feeling absurd on her tongue. "A fraud without any qualifications, tricking people under the guise of being a doctor." I stopped him. "If that isn't justice, what is?" Goss demanded. Rosalyn gritted her teeth. "You're a shameless liar. You were just jealous that his business was better than yours and that people liked him more." She had suspected this all along, but hearing him hide behind the word justice made her blood boil. The rain outside intensified, and a flash of lightning illuminated the room. Goss gave her a contemptuous look. "Even if that's what you think, it was still an act of justice. If it wasn't, why was my report accepted? Why were the police able to arrest him legally? Why did a solemn national court find him guilty based on ironclad evidence?" Rosalyn struggled to find the words to strike back. She knew he was using twisted logic, but as a 12-year-old, she couldn't quite articulate the flaw in his argument. "The answer is clear," Goss continued, shaking his head. "He secretly sent a command to his cybernetic implants, activating the clinic's defense system. Regil Hoffman is an evil criminal, and his wife and children are accomplices who profited from his crimes." "They are not," Rosalyn shouted. "You only reported him to steal his patients and make more money." "What if I did it for money?" Goss asked indifferently. "Incompetent frauds belong in prison. I'm just doing heaven's work while earning a little extra for my trouble. Is that so wrong? It's a simple matter, little girl. Black is black and white is white. What exactly did you expect me to say? What did you want to hear?" Rosalyn glared at him, her fists clenching and unclenching. "And even if I said what you wanted to hear, what would it change?" Goss sneered. "He's the one who confessed in court, not me. If you're so capable, why don't you report me? Oh, that's right, I actually have a medical license." Rosalyn fell into a heavy silence. She fought the urge to let a magic spell fly from her fingertips. She couldn't believe a human being could be so utterly shameless. She felt a physical revulsion, as if she were looking at an aberrant. She took a deep breath, trembling as she suppressed her rage. She turned around and walked out into the rain, feeling like a defeated dog under Goss's mocking gaze. The world outside was a cold, black sea. The damp air hit her face, clearing her mind instantly. Through the thick veil of rain, she spotted a familiar figure. Yvette stood a few meters away on the sidewalk, dressed in a black gown and holding a black umbrella. She looked perfectly composed, a goddess standing apart from the chaos of the storm. When she saw Rosalyn's dazed expression, the corners of her lips curled into a rare, faint smile. Rosalyn walked toward her, soaking wet and head bowed in shame. "Master, I'm sorry, Yvette did not scold her. Instead, she held the umbrella over Rosalyn's head and spoke softly. "You controlled your impulses just now. You didn't tear his shop apart. I am very pleased with you. As a reward, I have filed a report against Goss. Are you satisfied?" 10 minutes later, the sharp wail of a siren tore through the silence of the rainy night. A hovering police cruiser, its cold blue lights flashing rhythmically, descended with precision to land directly in front of the Groney clinic. Several officers stepped out of the vehicle and immediately restrained a terrified Goss Groney. They began a thorough search of the premises, eventually uncovering a series of hidden files within certain magic terminals. These records, heavily encrypted and disguised as mundane billing statements, revealed a dark web of illicit transactions. The list of crimes was staggering, involving the distribution of counterfeit medicine, addictive substances, illegal weapons, and restricted magical formulas. Faced with the exposure of these records and the overwhelming evidence provided by a mysterious anonymous whistleblower, the once arrogant Goss collapsed as if struck by lightning. He was dragged roughly into the police cruiser, meeting the exact same fate he had forced upon Regil Hoffman. In a dark corner of the street, standing beneath the shelter of an umbrella, Rosalyn watched the scene unfold with wide eyes. She whispered in a daze, "Master, was this your doing?" Yvette gave a slight nod, her voice as calm and detached as ever. She said, "In the Blackwater district, unless one is a saint, they are bound to be touched by the gray industries. It is simply a matter of how well they hide it. Fortunately, I am quite skilled at digging such things up." Like Rosalyn, Yvette had been deeply unsettled by the way the Hoffman family had been torn apart. She had been particularly suspicious because the report against Regil had occurred only a month after she joined the clinic. During that time, the clinic's clientele had surged due to rumors of a beautiful new nurse. Yvette suspected that if she hadn't insisted on staying there to observe, the sudden report might never have happened. Using her rune-hacking techniques, she had traced the anonymous tip sent to the police station. It had originated from the Groney clinic, less than 2 kilometers away, sent with absolutely no attempt at concealment. The truth was simple and petty. Goss had known about Regil's lack of a license for a long time, but as long as his own profits were higher, he hadn't bothered to act. However, the recent influx of patients to the Hoffman clinic, triggered by Yvette's presence, had stolen his business. Watching his own clinic grow quiet, Goss had lashed out with an anonymous email. In a way, Yvette had been the catalyst for the disaster, but she felt no guilt for the man's malice. She couldn't always ensure that good people were rewarded, but she could certainly make sure the wicked didn't sleep soundly. Moreover, she saw this as a vital lesson for her student. In the isolation of the wasteland, Rosalyn lacked the opportunities to face the harsh frustrations necessary for growth. This dream had finally provided that missing piece of her education. The autumn storm vanished as quickly as it had arrived. As they walked back, the clouds parted to reveal a silver crescent moon surrounded by a vast, shimmering galaxy of stars. Rosalyn, who had taken over the duty of carrying the umbrella, folded it and followed closely behind her master. She looked up at the unfamiliar constellations, so different from those of her homeland, and cleared her throat. With a hint of shy hesitation, she asked, "Master, did you investigate Dr. Groney because of me?" "No," Yvette replied without a hint of emotion, her pace never faltering. Rosalyn jogged a few steps to catch up, peering at Yvette's elegant profile. She said with thick skepticism, "Really?" She was convinced that Yvette had done it for her sake. After all, her master was a master who had seen through the world's illusions, yet she had personally intervened to break the knot in Rosalyn's heart. Rosalyn insisted firmly, "I think you did." "I did not," Yvette stated flatly. "You definitely did," Rosalyn countered with a grin. Yvette glanced at her, then closed her mouth and fell into a stubborn silence. Rosalyn didn't mind. She let out a little laugh and began to stride toward the right apartments with renewed energy. A few days later, the news of Goss being taken away by the police spread through Acid Street. Those who had suspected the truth behind the Hoffmans' downfall, like Susan, Hans, and Mary, openly cheered. The Groeny Clinic collapsed just as the Hoffman Clinic had, but with one key difference. No one came to offer Goss's family sympathy. When the verdict came down, Goss's fate was far worse than Regel's. Though his individual crimes were small, their sheer number resulted in a 12-year sentence, double what Regel had received. On the evening of the sentencing, the setting sun turned the apartment windows into frames of molten gold. Rosalyn leaned against the windowsill, watching Mrs. Susan busy herself at her roadside stall. Her heart felt lighter than it had in weeks. She turned to her master and said, "Master, Hans told me that Regel Hoffman received a lighter sentence of 6 years because a kind person paid off the judge and jury. He doesn't know who it was because so many people visited them during that time." Yvette sat on the sofa, her eyes fixed on the holographic screen in front of her. She asked softly, "And what do you think?" "I think it was definitely you," Rosalyn replied. "Why?" Yvette asked. Rosalyn made a bit of a face and said, "Because you said you were going to buy me the latest magic terminal, but you still haven't saved up enough money. I'm not hinting at anything, I promise." Yvette's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile, but she didn't respond. She had told her student that her 500,000 credits were reserved for the elemental decay completion technology. However, after taking a side job in the neighboring Gray Harbor city, she had ended up with a surplus. Half of that extra money had gone toward the bribes that reduced Regel's sentence from 10 years to 6. As for the other half, one only had to look at how Goss had hired an expensive lawyer and still received a maximum sentence to find the answer. Rosalyn took the silence as a confirmation. Satisfied, she looked back down at the street. She saw Brielle, dressed in a perfectly tailored Black Tower Middle School uniform, appearing by the roadside with 2 followers. They looked around as if searching for someone, and when they didn't find them, they bought pancakes from Mrs. Susan and walked away, chatting. The twilight cast long shadows of the elite students against the grimy pavement. Rosalyn started to say something to her master, but the world suddenly began to turn ethereal. The wallpaper, the window frame, and the noise from the street below blurred like an oil painting melting in warm water. Yvette stood up, now wearing a pure white dress. On her slender finger was a new magic ring containing the precious technical documents they had come for. She said quietly, "It's over." "Yes," Rosalyn murmured, her voice filled with a strange trance-like calm. "It's over." By nightfall, the two had returned to the real world. They rode their battered magic motorcycle from the ruins of the Blackwater district back toward the manor in the central district. As they passed the crumbling, vine-covered remains of the Black Tower, Rosalyn looked up from the sidecar, lost in thought. She remembered that for Hans and Mary, the pinnacle of success was to attend the school in that tower and work for its corporations. That dream was now impossible for them. A wave of sadness washed over her, but it was quickly replaced by a new resolve. She thought to herself that if she ever found a way back to her own home, she would build a tower there too. But it wouldn't be a black tower. It would be a white one, a lighthouse that could disperse the darkness of the night. A tower just like her master. Perhaps it was because the journey through the dream world had left her with too many beautiful memories, but once Rosalyn realized she would never see her friends Hans and Mary again, she fell into a long period of melancholy. She lost interest in exploring the wasteland. Instead, she spent her days studying rune knowledge or sitting on a chair in the manor, staring up at the towering ruins of the Black Tower that pierced the clouds. Yvette didn't offer much in the way of comfort, viewing it as a natural emotional response. Occasionally, she would accompany Rosalyn to the shattered dome at the top of the Black Tower. There, they would look out over the ruins of Ish City, soaking in the unique atmosphere of a world that had been destroyed and was now slowly being reborn. 4 months passed in this manner. As Ish Island transitioned from late summer to early winter, Yvette finally gained a preliminary grasp of elemental decay completion technology. She began the painstaking process of repairing the junk they had scavenged, such as elemental capacitors and energy storage boards. The repair process was arduous. The technology was incredibly intricate. The slightest oversight during the completion phase could ruin a battery entirely. After several large storage boards were destroyed, Yvette finally succeeded with one. It was a unit salvaged from a magic-driven locomotive, boasting a full 200 points of mana, nearly a third of Yvette's own capacity. With this success, Yvette's long-held ambition was finally realized. She declared with a certain cold satisfaction, "From now on, I can finally use the electric grid to fry those little thieves who keep stealing from our garden." Rosalyn was quite resistant to the idea. She didn't mind a perimeter around the manor to keep out mutants, but electrifying the vegetable patch felt cruel to the local wildlife. However, she couldn't defy her master's orders. In the weeks that followed, Rosalyn often found the charred remains of squirrels, wild cats, or birds near the garden. With a heavy heart, she buried each one, marking their graves with small wooden sticks. Eventually, the corners of the manor grounds were so filled with these tiny memorials that the place began to look like a cemetery, a sight Yvette found rather dampening to the aesthetic. Still, there were undeniable benefits to Yvette mastering the technology. The manor no longer suffered from frequent power outages. At night, streetlights illuminated the interior and even the safe zones outside. Most importantly, as winter set in, they had heaters. They no longer had to huddle in thick layers of clothing or use their own magic to stay warm. Rosalyn suspected that if they hadn't left the dream world so quickly, Yvette might have even learned to repair magic soldiers or mechanical golems. She truly believed her master was a peerless genius. One morning in early February, a fierce blizzard struck Ish Island. The wind howled, whipping the snow into a chaotic white void that blurred the line between earth and sky. Inside the manor, however, the storm had lost its bite. The heaters hummed, filling the room with warmth. Yvette sat by the floor-to-ceiling window in the living room, cradling a bone china cup of steaming black tea. She watched the swirling chaos outside with a relaxed expression. When Rosalyn came downstairs to prepare lunch, Yvette called her over. Yvette looked up from her tea and said, "I am transferring 3 new spell structures to your terminal." Rosalyn checked her device and asked with surprise, "Master, what are these?" 3 new mid-sized spells," Yvette explained, her eyes still on the snow. "The structures are finalized, though I haven't optimized them yet. Your ring has plenty of storage, so record them now and start practicing." These spells were the result of Yvette's research into the Origin Civilization's networks. Each was a 50,000 scale spell, true mid-tier magic. While Yvette could have designed even more powerful spells, they would have been useless due to hardware limitations. The magic terminal's rune buffer acted like a bottleneck, much like video memory on a graphics card. Rosalyn's Sky Ring Y2 was a high-end device with 1.2 million storage units, but its buffer was capped at 60,000. Anything larger simply couldn't be cast. Even the Black Tower S3, a top-tier civilian ring Yvette had purchased for 30,000 credits, shared this 60,000 unit limit. It was a deliberate technological blockade by the manufacturers to ensure military-grade equipment remained superior. After lunch, Rosalyn sat at the dining table and began to review the new spells with excitement. Her basic elemental spells were already perfected, but these new additions were specialized. The first was the Regeneration Pump. It was an advanced version of her previous healing magic. Not only did it accelerate recovery, but it also manifested a phantom heart outside the body that would draw in spilled blood and pump it back into the system, preventing weakness from blood loss. The second was Crimson Armor. Upon activation, dark red runes would crawl across the user's skin, granting immense resistance to physical impacts and extreme temperatures. It was designed to prevent sudden, fatal ambushes by mutants. The third was the Muscle Unlimiter. This spell focused on physical enhancement, drastically increasing strength, stamina, and reaction speed. Combined with the Crimson Armor, it would allow Rosalyn to fight as a battle mage, tearing through low-level mutants with her bare hands. The downside was the cost. Each spell required 20 mana points and lasted only 10 minutes. With Rosalyn's current mana pool of 45, using both would leave her with almost nothing for her elemental spells. She knew she had to work harder on her meditation. She imagined a future where she could maintain both enhancements while raining down fire and ice, truly becoming a force to be reckoned with on Ish Island. Half a month later, a bone-chilling frost gripped the morning. Outside, the air was so cold it seemed to freeze one's very breath, and the frost on the window panes formed intricate patterns like crystal crests. These icy mandalas caught the faint morning light, shattering and refracting it into a shimmering, hazy rainbow across the room. Standing in the cozy warmth of the manor, Rosalyn prepared to head out. She draped a thick cloak over her shoulders and turned to see her master. Yvette had changed into a beige trench coat over a gray turtleneck sweater. The outfit gave her slender frame an air of intellectual grace that contrasted with her youthful face. Their clothing had come from the underground warehouse of an abandoned garment factory. Whether it was due to the advanced preservation technology of the Origin civilization, the strange properties of nanofibers, or some specific chemical treatment, nearly half the stock had survived 600 years. They had escaped the ravages of microbes, light, and heat, falling into the hands of the two survivors. Without these finds, their lack of textile knowledge would have left them trapped indoors all winter for lack of warm layers. Rosalyn walked over and gently adjusted her master's collar. She announced with a bright, determined smile, "Let's go, master." Their destination was the East District of Ish City, near Greyport. Based on Rosalyn's memories of her dreams, a military base belonging to the New Eden government should be located there. Now that Yvette possessed elemental decay completion technology, she intended to scavenge military-grade magic equipment. If they could find functional gear and repair the elemental capacitors, they would have a significant advantage. It was a gamble, of course. If the quality was high enough to survive 6 centuries, Yvette would simply swap the batteries and bring the gear home. If nothing worked, they would treat the trip as a simple scouting mission. 30 minutes later, the hum of their magic locomotive faded as they arrived at the gates of the desolate military base. The bitter cold seemed to have suppressed the mutants' activity. The journey had been eerily quiet, the world transformed into a vast, white void of snow. They entered the base, systematically clearing out a few humanoid mutants that crossed their path. They moved through several open armories where Yvette tested the remaining magic equipment. To her disappointment, no matter how much mana she channeled into the devices, they remained unresponsive. After checking several rooms, a sense of futility began to settle over her. However, deep within the facility, in a cavernous hall that looked like a large training ground, Rosalyn made a discovery. A semi-mechanical mutant stood in the shadows. Unlike others they had seen, this creature had military-grade alloy blades fused to its arms. Upon sensing Rosalyn's intrusion, the creature hissed, and the blades ignited with a crackle of electricity and a distinctive, high-pitched hum. When Yvette arrived at the scene, she quickly dismantled the creature. After stripping away the necrotic flesh clinging to the metal, she realized the blades were actually held by bionic mechanical hands. They weren't fused to the bone, but gripped firmly, meaning they could be detached and used. Rosalyn gripped one of the alloy blades and activated it. As the metal vibrated with power and sparks danced along the edge, she whispered in awe, "So cool." Even Yvette was surprised. After a morning of finding nothing, she hadn't expected to loot such high-quality gear directly from a mutant. It occurred to her that while semi-mechanical mutants were more dangerous than biological ones, the potential for salvage made them valuable targets for the future. Rosalyn deactivated the combat mode, stroking the now silent blade. She asked curiously, "Master, how good is this sword? Is it powerful?" Connecting her magic terminal to the weapon to scan its parameters, Yvette nodded slightly. "It is decent. This is a Ripper Type 7, a proprietary military series from the New Eden Republic. It features 2 primary effects, high-frequency oscillation and high-voltage current. Because the magic circuits were encrypted and returned only garbled code, Yvette couldn't determine the exact specifications or quality of the enchantments. However, based on a quick test, she estimated that if paired with the Muscle Unlimiter spell, the weapon's destructive power would rival her own lightning wrath. It would certainly be enough to one-shot a basic mutant. The battery decay was still an issue, however. The mutant had likely been powering the blades with its own biological energy. Now that they were detached, the elemental capacitors were nearly drained. Furthermore, the oscillation and electrical effects consumed energy at a staggering rate. If Rosalyn used it without a recharge, her mana reserves would be depleted in less than half an hour. They searched for a while longer, but found nothing else of value. Before noon, they returned to the manor, where Yvette immediately began the restoration process, bringing the two military blades back to peak condition. That afternoon, as Yvette watched Rosalyn practicing her swings in the cold wind of the courtyard, she decided to prioritize the optimization of the Crimson Armor and Muscle Unlimiter spells. It wasn't just for her student's sake. Truthfully, even Yvette felt a stir of excitement looking at the ancient military weapons. After all, she thought to herself, what boy could resist the allure of a fine blade? Even in her current form, that fundamental instinct remained. Of course, from a purely practical standpoint, a barrage of traditional elemental magic was far more efficient than melee combat, but having more options was never a bad thing. Time flowed swiftly. 3 months vanished as winter gave way to the late spring and early summer. Through careful iteration, Yvette finally optimized the Crimson Armor and Muscle Unlimiter spells to their theoretical limits, drastically reducing their mana consumption. Most importantly, she modified the coverage mechanism of the Crimson Armor. Now, the spell protected the user's clothing as well, ensuring that intense combat wouldn't result in Rosalyn's outfits being shredded. Rosalyn was delighted. She had been training intensely with the blades, not because she wanted to abandon magic, but because her current mana pressure was low. If she and Yvette cast the same spell with the same amount of mana, Yvette's output was vastly superior. However, the Ripper blades were different. Their power came from the internal high-voltage capacitors. By simply swinging the blade, Rosalyn could achieve destructive power comparable to her master's. Driven by a simple desire to share her master's burden, Rosalyn leaned into the combat style that offered her the most immediate strength. Yvette, meanwhile, eventually gave up on her own melee practice. It was too time-consuming, and she had far more important things to do. With the armor and physical enhancement spells perfected, Yvette turned her attention to the regeneration pump. She wanted to add a function that could handle emergency treatment for mutation virus infections. The difficulty lay in her total ignorance of the virus itself. She only knew it was blood-borne and highly infectious. To study the purification effects, she realized she would need to begin biological experiments on small animals. And so, life in the Green Manor amidst the wasteland returned to a peaceful routine. Exploration, meditation, study, and experimentation filled their days. In this quiet, steady rhythm, 3 years passed in the blink of an eye. Another midsummer had arrived, and the azure sky was as clear as a polished gem. The sunlight poured down like molten amber, casting a golden rim over the rusted remains of the abandoned port. Rosalyn Scene, now 16 years old, stood atop a half-collapsed watchtower, silently observing the desolate harbor below. The salty sea breeze brushed against her nose, and the tower walls beneath her were thick with moss and climbing vines, their dewdrops sparkling in the morning light. Compared to when she had first arrived 6 years ago, the young woman had grown significantly more mature and striking. She stood nearly 170 centimeters tall, now a full forehead taller than the master she used to look up to. Her delicate face had lost its childhood roundness, replaced by a calm composure that mirrored her mentor's, yet possessed a more vibrant spark of life. After watching the harbor for a while, she leaned her notebook against the rusted railing and began to write. She whispered the words as she recorded them: Greyport District, colony of aberrant beetles, all are base types, no evolutionary variants discovered. Bodies are decayed and covered in fleshy tissue. Primary attacks include claw strikes and horn rams. Note, they prefer dark areas like shipping containers and cracks in the breakwater. Beware of ambushes. A moment later, having finished her observations, Rosalyn hummed a nameless tune. Like a sudden gust of wind, she drifted from the top of the tower and floated gracefully down to the cracked streets of Greyport City.